CBC News with a special series called Learning Curve, the impact COVID-19 and the pandemic has had on your children. The focus this morning, physical health, because of a lack of exercise. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson has been doing the reporting with me now live. Nice to see you, Deanna, on all of this. You're absolutely right. The physical, not activity, inactivity, everything shut down. What effect did that have on Canada's young people?
Thank you so much, Heather, for having me on. We have lots more stories coming your way. But, you know, throughout the pandemic, we've covered that lag in math, in literacy, all those academic gaps that kids have experienced. And of course, there is a very real gap in physical activity. Remember the pre-pandemic days when a lot of parents, a lot of adults worried about screen time, activity, kids being too sedentary, spending too much time in front of their laptops or video games. Well, the pandemic happened and perhaps naturally other priorities had to take place, keeping people safe, containing the pandemic. Schools moved online for a large chunk of the time, but it even went beyond that. We know that team sports were closed. Gym largely wrapped up in many schools. In fact, it just started picking up in the last few months. If your kid was into, let's say, dance, those dance competitions, dance classes were also closed. In some cases, in the earlier parts of the pandemic, even public parks were closed. So a lot of the kids' natural access to activity was simply shuttered. And what the researchers are saying is kids' activity was not great even before the pandemic. So researchers in Canada look at three ways of assessing kids' wellness. There is getting adequate sleep, getting adequate exercise, and getting not too much screen time. And before the pandemic, that number was between 15 and 20% of kids. Only 15 to 20% of kids were meeting those guidelines. Now, move to the earlier part of the pandemic, around early spring of 2020, and that number drops down to 3. That meant that 97% of kids were not meeting the age-appropriate guidelines on movement, screen time, and sleep. We got a chance to speak to Professor Sarah Moore at Dalhousie University. She has been researching this, and she was the lead author in several studies on it. Here's what she had to say about that.
Physical inactivity and increased screen time should really be considered a collateral consequence of the pandemic for these kids. And some of the things that we're worried about are their physical, mental health. And so we're thinking that, you know, children may be less fit as a result of being less active. They may also be experiencing higher levels of depression and anxiety as a result of the pandemic. And there are some data to be able to support that.
And we know there's lots of concern about that as well, of course, Heather, mental health, right?
Absolutely. But in terms of the physical aspect of all of this, that's kind of a stunning number, how few are meeting those guidelines, Deanna. What are parents, what are schools doing to try to get Canadian kids active again?
Well, we know, I think the parents are doing the best they can, certainly since in the latter waves of the pandemic and since the vaccination has picked up. I think a lot of people have re-enrolled their kids in physical activities. What we're looking at right now, we spent a delightful day with the Winchester Primary and Middle School here in Toronto, and they have their annual wellness days back. They're learning to juggle, they were learning to play cricket, the little kids were running. And what the teachers told me, and their principal, who's been running these wellness days for a few years now, is it's all about introducing low impact, fun, not super competitive activities. In other words, your kid doesn't need to be a pro style athlete or on track to joining the NHL or something. Here's cricket, of course, a huge deal to people from many cultures who live here in Canada. And now they're having some cricket lessons in schools. That's what the Ontario School Cricket Association is doing. So what the experts are saying is just try to have fun. Build it into the things you do with your family. It can be a walk after dinner. It can be a little bike ride on the weekend. It doesn't need to be something really huge. Start off small, but make activity a part of everyday life. Heather.
Excellent advice, Deanna. Thank you. And we'll look forward to your coming back with some more of your reporting for this series. Thanks, Deanna Sumanak-Johnson. And online, if you want to read more about the research that tells us about this drop in physical activity and the advice for parents and teachers on helping kids kick that slump and get back in action, it's up online this morning at CBCNews.ca.